And if we are at live. Hello, gang. RJ's Evolution Hour 23. Fabulous logo saying RJ's Evolution Hour, so that means it must be Evolution Hour. This came from a video listener question about the exciting world of sex and how did it evolve and all of that. And I thought, well, actually, that's kind of an interesting little question. I want to know when it evolved and also how it evolved. So I did some fun little research because thanks to Jackson, who is here in the room, I had been following up on an old 1972 paper that was quite seminal on gamete dimorphism and female reproduction, about the theory of why gametes function the way they do in a sexual context and how that developed the kinds of formats and anisogamy, size differentiation and sexual differentiation between the formats and very specialized sperm and all of that later on. And it became a very, very well-developed paper because I found a whole slew of technical literature after that, of which, ironically, quite a lot was directly relevant to this question of when did evolution develop sex. And so I've got I put linkages to all the papers that kind of give you portals into the area that you can follow up on. And first things that struck my mind, put this little puppy up here in the exciting world of old fart Jimmy does not know how to run the technology yet. Boop. Let's do the share. And Zot. Everybody can see this. It's a simplified diagram from that 2013 paper on there. I think it's Heroide, where you're seeing on one end good old chlamydia bunch, and then gonium, of which Jackson has quite a bit to say, I believe, about, and then pandorina, and then down the road here to increasingly complex cellular structures, and then we start finding in this bunch here the clear formation of sexual reproduction and Volvox, an interesting little group, represents all of the different range. And I found out in following up on this, yet another work, 2009 review that goes into the actual details of that Volvox bunch. You can see on the right side here, a whole slew of living forms are actually known, and they go into all the descriptions of them, and also fossil groupings. And you can see that they thought that sexual recombination in Volvox was a fairly recent phenomenon, as a little bit later in the Jurassic, but this new study actually pushed them back all the way into the Triassic. And I call attention to this little critter down here that I'm highlighting, which is this Basiliclamus with 4 undifferentiated cells embedded in a small volume. That's all the different range you would want to have in living and fossil forms to track the development of sexual reproduction in this. And what it also means is that you've got a good argument to be made that sexual reproduction occurred repeatedly in various kinds of organisms. Now, I'll put a question to you, Jackson, because I haven't studied the material at full depth to be able to get a good sense about this. Is the common consensus view now that the kind of sexual system that we see in our branch of metazoans, including plants and animals, are those thought to have been developed in a precursor multicellular system that would date back maybe 1 billion years or more? Or are they thinking that maybe that sexual reproduction developed independently in plants and animals? I haven't delved into that far enough to say.
Well, at the very least, sex has independently evolved many times. The paper you sent me on the Volvocene fusogens was referring to some glycoproteins, which is what fusogens are, the glycoproteins in the cell membrane that facilitate the movement of the gametes so that they can mate. And so what these guys were showing with these, what were they? I forget what the microbe specifically was. This Volvocene.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact one because there's a whole bunch of them. Is that 2013 paper?
No, it was 2014.
Okay.
It was the one on post-translational something or other. Anyways, this protein, fusogen, predates, or it is highly conserved, if I remember correctly, among a lot of different eukaryotes. And so so it might be that sex evolved independently in different lineages thanks to this protein. I don't quite. I
Yeah, I
can
think for the
probably
couple
look
of
it
the
up.
papers have called that I linked to call attention to the fact that we just don't have the fossils. So all of it has to be done by retroengineering and phylogenetic analysis of the genes to try to surmise when things were branching off of one thing or another, and then try to work through, well, this would have taken place during this period, and then hope maybe somehow or other you'd be able to find the forensic clues of it. But when you get far enough back before pre-plants and before the metazoans that show up in the Cambrian, now you're at the mercy of fossilization, and you can find cellular embryos that you can get up to about 0.5 millimeter that can be preserved through phosphatization, but above that level, basically, they're still invisible. Phosphatization won't preserve them, and then you got to get a Lagerstätten class deposit that'll be able to preserve very, very fine parts to be able to see any of the details. So if you're talking about a very tiny organism that you could fit a bunch of them on your fingernail, the odds of them being fossilized are just fabulously remote. So it wouldn't surprise me either way. The fact that the Volvox bunch has been able to develop sexual reproduction independently and relatively recently, all on its own, in the same way that endosymbiotic processes are occurring again and again still in biology. They don't need to be fabulously common. They only need to be occasionally happening. And I wouldn't be surprised either way if a lot of the superstructure of sexual reproduction predated the split between plants and animals. But then again, I wouldn't be amazed and surprised if a lot of the details didn't come about until that split, and that we're running off of side structures in the same way that we've seen in the feather hair case, how keratin structures sprouting from epidermal layers, from placodes, independently in birds and mammals developed hair and feathers from a deep substrate where the ancestor form has none of that, but it's got the pieces that eventually turn into the pieces that connect up to make the pieces that blah, blah, blah. And sex may very well be that. Now, one of the big things that I call attention to in the remainder of the papers here is, why is sex maintained? That was the other question, not only the how and the what, but why. Because sex is really costly for an organism to do. It has to go through a lot of rigmarole in addition to buying people roses. In any organism, it's a very complicated thing to do. Why spend all that energy on it when you can reproduce asexually? And it turns out one of the primary arguments here, and there's one of the review papers that I put up that go into all the different issues on it, but the one that's most prevalent today, and they're not mutually exclusive, is the red queen argument, the parasite argument. That the reason why sex is sustained is that it can shuffle the genetic deck faster than its parasites can adapt to it. And we don't have to guess at this. One of the reasons why the view has become so prevalent is because we can see it happening when you look at the asexual organisms, that they always have to have some way to protect themselves from parasites. And so I put a link in on the paper to the thing that we did on Fodor earlier, because that I brought up the aphid example there, and I had several of the papers, I think, in the links to go on that we can physically observe that if you find an asexually reproducing species, they've got to find some way through bacterial symbionts or some other deflection mechanism to be able to combat their parasites without having to use sex. Otherwise, they're not going to be sexual. They'll have to be sexual because that's the only way they can keep at it. So that's part of the big argument. You, by delightful serendipity, had just been looking into some of these issues of sexual reproduction in your own work. So I'm going to punt over to you for a while for you to kind of give us a summary of what you've been doing in that area in your own study.
Yeah, I was originally looking it up because I was very interested in this phenomenon. Why are there two different sexes? And of course, to combat the creationist nonsense that there can't be two sexes because there's some sort of uncrossable divide between the sexes. But really, sex is a lot more fluid than that. It's very fluid. In fact, there are different lineages of
Yeah.
animals that flip back and forth through Mendelian dominance, like rotifers. Different lineages of rotifers can
Oh,
go.
and the lesbian fish. That's hilarious.
Oh
There's a
yeah,
whole bunch of examples of those.
the Amazon mollies,
Stunning.
the Spitacilus
Yeah.
uniparens, which is the whiptail lizard, which the lesbian lizards.
Yeah.
Uh,
In fact, our mammal sex is surprisingly boring by comparison to most of the other animal
yeah,
kingdom.
yeah, it's very interesting, and so I was looking up papers. The first one I came across was the 1972 paper on anisogamy and how the first sex cells, the first gametes, would have been isogamous, and so thanks to the fusogens that paper was talking about, it
Mhm.
shows that
Was
there is
that that Parker and Baker paper?
the 2014 one on
Well, the original 1972 paper, the one from the journal.
no, that wasn't. Yeah, the 1972 paper was on the origin of anisogamy.
Mhm.
Uh, and so that one was talking about how there through simple Mendelian dominance you can uh, start to divide the population up uh, into gametes of slightly different sizes, and then through that, as that population will continue to evolve, they will eventually reach a near a 1-to-1 stable ratio, uh, which
Mhm.
is most beneficial to the population. And so,
Oh, yeah. Let me just interject at one point because I failed to mention it earlier that one of the things that pops up in that chart and that paper that discusses that is the relationship between sex and multicellularity. That probably
mhm,
one of the reasons why that developed initially was the fact that when cells start cooperating in a multicellular context, even before they become an organism in what we usually think of as the term, the exchange of information going on genetically leads to the things that eventually lead to the sexual reproduction. And it's sort of a side effect, in a way, of the formation of multicellularity. And it's no coincidence then that Volvox and these others are developing a lot of this stuff because they're developing a multicellular modality and they have to compensate for it. So this is one of those things that you get into higher level issues that sex pops up not infrequently because it must be something that fits in nicely with a multicellular organism.
mhm. Oh, gonium pectorale, I assume is how you pronounce it, is the one they were doing the fusogen research on. Uh,
Mm.
they were looking at this gene, or this is called the gamete fusogen. Sorry, is a protein. GCS1 is what predates sex, and so this protein is sort of favoring one sex over the other in these gonium, and so it's kind of homologous to males and females in that
Yeah.
regard.
And probably another factor that bears into this whole issue is the role that mitochondria have played, because they tend to skew. In fact, there's some new papers out I didn't put up in the linkages on why mitochondria tend to favor female rather than male lines and how that bumps into the situation. Although theoretically, some mitochondria can be inherited by the male line, but it's just relatively rare. So there's
Yeah.
a whole issue about what a battle between the male and the female versions of the genes as to which one gets to call the shots once the organism becomes fully operational. And parental imprinting, I think, is the term for it. That it's kind of funny because when I was at the intelligent design gathering earlier in the year, I think it was Axe or Gager, one of the two, was talking about what was parental imprinting, and she couldn't remember the term, and nobody in the audience could remember the term. And she's sitting there up there for about 10, 20 seconds, and I finally wrote, parental imprinting! From the back of the room.
Really?
And jump started it. I, the non-biologist, knew the terminology, and they didn't. Oh, well.
I don't know. They always seem to they almost pretend to be biologists sometimes. Which reminds me,
Well, Gauger and the bunch were. They are, in fact, biologists, and they've been printed in regular science journals. But the thing
right. Yeah.
is there's kind of like a lid
Hmm.
on just how far their imagination goes, because there are things that they don't allow to be true. So ultimately, too much natural variation
Oh
causing
yeah.
things to happen naturally. Well, once they get into this design gig, they have a terrible problem investigating anything that doesn't look like design. So they've got to kind of channel their own brain, and that ultimately atrophies. It's very, very
Yeah, that was
terrible.
that the paper on Yersinia, which is the Black Plague, or was
Hmm.
it the Black Plague? Yeah, organism,
Yeah,
because the
Yersinia pestis.
yeah Yersinia pestis. That paper, the one that was written on why they have the genes for flagella but don't develop flagella, that was written by a design person. You pointed out to me. I can't remember who it was.
Oh, would that be Minnick?
Yes, that was Minnick. Yeah.
Yeah, Scott Minnick. He actually is one of the very few people in the design community that actually is a bacterial flagellum researcher. So it's kind of the thing of like, this is all information under your nose. Gunter Beckley, who's the paleontologist, he's an insect paleontologist, has just jumped on the intelligent design bandwagon, and he's just started to post stuff now at Evolution News and Science Today. Is another one of those where you feel that once they get on that bandwagon, their brain is just going to petrify, because they're going to have to stop paying attention to most of the data. And so far, all of his postings seem just boilerplate anti-evolutionism. Jonathan Wells could have written a claptrap, is what he's done. Anyway, back to multicellularity and sex. Um, yeah, you mentioned the gonium one and others. And what intrigues me about all of this is that this enormous amount of genetic diversity that they've been finding, and looking at the fiddly bit details, that it's all a mechanistic trade-off of systems. There's nothing that apparently is designy to it.
Hmm.
And no intelligent design advocate I've ever seen has ever tried to explain what design events were involved in any of that stuff. They don't really bother about it at all.
Well, I'm not entirely surprised. I mean, Darwin threw down the gauntlet in Origin of Species, saying you're going to have to explain each of these things
Yeah.
as separate design events. You know, which
Yeah,
is by
and
far the least parsimonious answer you can have.
yeah, and the thing is that they don't even try. One of the things that I've been doing in the TIP project is looking at pivotal issues and find out, okay, what do they think happened? And you, of course, you're reading Evolution Slam Dunk, so you can see how far they're getting on the reptile-mammal transition.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
the same is true for speciation issues. That there's just simply big holes in their own thought processes as to what they do to conceptualize what's going on. If you ask an intelligent design advocate, how many design events were there with the flagellum and when? And if I were to get in a time machine and watch, what would I be seeing? They've never bothered to think about that. It's just the designer designs, and don't ask us any more details.
Yeah. I saw someone a long time ago. I saw someone, well, relatively speaking, I saw an article about someone who was saying this is the reason Genesis can't be taken literally, is it doesn't tell us how long it took God to create these things, how long he rested on each day. Did it take him the whole day to create each thing? Did it take him half a day? It doesn't provide any of the fiddly bit details, and so
Yeah.
I remember
Well, to
seeing that.
some extent, your young Earth creationists at least have a weird half leg to stand on, because they can go with God just going zot. And so they can have all these animals poofing into existence on a single day. In some respects, even the fact that the plants get along, okay, they only have to hunker along a few days until the sun's made. So if they really think about it, yeah, they can kind of structure it. But then they got to figure out how all of this could actually have been taking place and what the Egyptians were doing and how come they didn't notice. Hi,
Why they
Ev
were making
mentions
beer.
over there in the live chat, the more well studied you are in evolution, the harder it is to remain anti-evolution. Yeah, that's true. It can be argued that the deeper you are in the field, the harder it is to deal with all the data stream. It's no coincidence that Minnick is a relatively minor player on the field of flagellum research, and that Michael Behe is not a player on any of those fields. that he doesn't even bother citing his own material. He's not trying to argue that intelligent design is visible from protein folding, which was an area that he had actually kind of studied. No, he jumps over to flagella or the immune system or cellular transport, areas that are not his area of expertise in the biochemistry, and thinks that he can just interlope on that. He's tended to shy away from paleontology. And as you have already spotted, I hope in Slam Dunk, paleontology is not their friend.
Oh yeah, especially
And
Charles Krieger's.
oh gosh, isn't he a hoot? To tell the audience a little about Krieger is a young Earth creationist who had written an analysis of Kathleen Hunt's piece from
Analysis in
1997.
quotes.
Yeah, in from Talk Origins Archive, and it's a very still a very good breakdown of the various critters involved in the reptile-mammal transition, although it is 20 years old. And so Krieger had written a snarky analysis of it back in 2003, which I had prudently made a print copy of. And then I discovered that a version of it popped up anonymously at creation.com. Not under his own name, but all you had to do was compare the two versions and you realize, no, this is Krieger. So I now had Krieger 2003 versus Krieger 2008, trying to snark his way through. And you and I both loved the one where he
Oh
talks
my
about
god.
mouse, a thing that looks like
Oh.
a mouse.
Yeah, Eosostrodon, Morganucodon, and Haldanodon are varieties of mice.
Yeah.
I fell over reading that. For anyone who
And
doesn't know, I work in the Department of Mammalogy, so that's kind of something I should know about.
yeah, well, and remember too, you've already hit earlier in the book where I call attention to Michael Denton on the thylacines, and in fact, a bunch of different
Oh
creationists who
yeah.
make a big deal about trying to dismiss convergence, and they're saying, look at the convergent thylacine wolf. You know, you can hardly tell them apart. And I said, no, you can tell them apart. That yeah, they've got some superficial features that are wolf-like, but the moment you look at the skulls, the moment you look at the tooth ratios and all the details of it, no, they're easily, I can do that. It's that visible once you look at them closely. And it meant that none of these people ever looked closely. Or Krieger,
Oh no.
who little things that look kind of mousy and
Oh.
decides they're just mice without ever bothering about the diagnostic characteristics of how you can tell a mouse, especially its tooth and the teeth,
Oh yeah.
which, and the
Yeah.
neat thing about it is that the teeth, so many of the mammals are known only from teeth because they're extremely durable. So you often have things where you don't have the rest of the critter. All you got is the tooth. The same way with shark teeth, you know, the rest of the body is cartilage, and so it very rarely fossilizes. But we now have paleogenomics. So they've literally been able to retro-engineer teeth based on just a couple genes and tweaking 1-point mutation that you can produce the little cusps and all the different variations on them. And it's like 100 million years worth. In other words, pushing all the way back into the reptile-mammal transition so that you've actually got extinct forms that are in sidelines that they've been able to retro-engineer those tooth forms so they would literally know the gene switches that were needed to produce them back in time, even though they're now extinct. Now that is more slam dunk, in my opinion.
Very true. Yeah, that bit about them having teeth like mice is just it was just embarrassing. I feel like
Yeah,
even an
yeah.
amateur should, which just goes to show he's never looked at the jaws of mice.
Never bothered to look.
Because
Remember,
yeah,
I
he would know immediately.
I cut Krieger some slack because in the early 2000s, when a lot of this stuff wasn't available online. But that's no excuse now. Our friend, Gonna Go For It, says, late to the party, did I miss any good graphics? Actually, yes, but the 2009 paper that I put up and the 2013 paper that I put up in the description have the charts involved on this. There were ones showing the fossil record for the Volvox bunch, where they worked out its development of sexuality from a 4-cell form to the cellular forms, sexually reproducing forms, and a whole paper on that and discussion of that. And then the 2013 one goes into the details of the different taxa that are involved in the development, where we can trace how sexuality develops in these earlier organisms, and that presumably is what was going on in the earlier bits. So I'll put it on for you that you can find it directly in the sources, because I've already closed down the pull-ups that I put in, so I can't yank them in. But you can find them all in there, because that's where I got them from. All of them are open access. I make a point that it's I can't stand it when somebody puts up a link to an abstract that you'd have to have a subscription to get to. Jerry Coyne does that a lot, and I feel like going, yeah. No, I'm a poverty-stricken person, and I appreciate other poverty-stricken people. So if it's open access, you want to give people things that they can get to free, and they can look it up on their own, so you don't have to take my word for it, or Jackson's word for it, or anybody's word for it, and follow up on their own. And I defy you to read through any of those works and not be impressed by the meticulousness of them, the scientific imagination, and all of the sources that you can then track down on your own that they relied on, and you can do the same follow-up work that I did on it to see where things are going. You can see the scientific process in action. And boy, is it different than what's going on over in creationism land, which brings up a show and tell from Jackson. You were, or rather, talk and tell about Eric Hovind and the sexuality issue, and then what else you discovered on that website. You got to tell us.
I was actually thinking of the the Esselstyn paper. That's what I was thinking of. Did I tell you? I did tell you I showed it. I showed the Esselstyn paper to Dr. Esselstyn today, and he read it and he thought it was kind of laughed at it.
Yeah, Elizabeth Mitchell, who I rake over the coals in Slam Dunk quite a few times, wrote a little piece on this particular scientist's paper, trying to riff off of it. And Jackson, since he knew the person, could actually show it to him. The thing that is the frustrating part is there are going to be millions of people out there in creationism land who may be aware of Mitchell's piece and have no clue that the paper she just cited, the author says bullpucky. Yeah. And that's why it's up to people like us to kind of ferret that through. I know some scientists just don't like to get involved in these issues.
Yeah, he as well as the other ones really don't.
Yeah, Dembski's no free lunch argument, which was riffing off of two scientists who had come up with the no free lunch theorem, which was an analysis of evolutionary algorithms and which ones worked and which one didn't and why. It turns out that one of the authors of it, who I contacted both of them, by the way, to find out what they were thinking about Dembski. And the one said basically he just didn't want to get involved in any of this stuff. He got uncomfortable discussing things with anti-evolutionists, and so he was just kind of shied away. Now, the other one had a very different attitude, and he actually wrote a scathing criticism of Dembski, pointing out, excuse me, do not try to use my work. You clearly do not understand it.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, we were talking about that the other day. It's just a lot of the working scientists, they don't want to get involved. They don't really have time to do it. They're too busy writing papers and teaching classes and these other things to really bother with these gnats.
Which is why us have that obligation to do that. And so one of the things I'd like to see occur is much more pushback. A science strike force. There's Sci Strikes have his bunch have a thing that could theoretically form the scaffolding of this. But the thing that strikes me is how, for example, NCSE, National Center for Science Education, doesn't do that. They don't do pushback. I follow every single one of them on Twitter, all the ones that actually have Twitter accounts, and they're not pushing back against Answers in Genesis and the Discovery Institute and David Klinghoffer and all the rest who are all on Twitter and put off their little links constantly. But I follow them, and anybody else can follow them as well. I know Sci Strike pops in every once in a while on Answers in Genesis posts, and I do as well. Sometimes we do tag team on it. Cy is more prone to ending his sentences with jackass, whereas I'm rather more polite, but nonetheless also persnickety on it. And the same thing with you, Ross, the old Earth creationist. He actually is more of a techno geek. And he would tend to put up papers which I call gee whiz stuff. Gee, how complicated X is. Isn't this wonderful? Shows design. And then I would look up the background of the thing and put up a technical paper relevant to the evolution of X. And he's done less and less of that. He's stuck way more in his field of cosmology, where he'll talk about redshifts and various stuff in the science literature. And then he's shied more away from biology fields. I'm hoping maybe I've had an effect on him. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, so the other show and tell that you were referring to. So today, it's very funny that someone sent me a topic related to the one we're talking about tonight. Much more serendipity, and so this article he sent me was he took a screenshot of the article, and it was referring to what we were talking about earlier. How could there be two sexes according to evolution? Turns out he linked to the original article, and it was written by, drumroll please, Eric Hovind.
The noted
Eric
great
Hovind.
Scientist, air quotes.
Yeah, and the article is just, oh, it's bad. I mean, to say it's bad is to be nice to it. It's allow me to quote just to show how bad this is. It says, "Where did the thousands of compounds we find in the world come from? Carbon dioxide, sodium chloride, calcium hydroxide, etc. They could not have developed from the elements because elements rarely react with each other."
Well, I can tell you something that doesn't
wow.
apparently react much in Eric Hovind's brain, and apparently it's his neurons.
For those of you who don't know, if you decide to get a science degree, you will have to take chemistry.
So, yeah, and where you discover just exactly how reactive oxygen in particular. That's the whole point of oxygen. Oxygen is promiscuous. It's the reason why a silicon-based organism is difficult, because the oxygen wants to react to it. It's that combustion stuff we seem to be kind of familiar with in forest fires. That's elements reacting naturally. They don't require, what does he think? That Jesus Christ has to come down and make water or fire or something that cause chemicals to react. The only ones that are actually inert, of course, are the inert gases. Your heliums and neon and all that.
And the whole column right next to the noble gases is halogens, which are incredibly reactive. You won't find them alone in nature.
Hayev says over in the live chat, "I'll bet Eric was cribbing from his daddy, which he loves to do." Oh, probably. Yeah. Because as I pointed out to Jackson when we were talking about this before we went on air, Eric is not a fact claimant, and Kent Hovind is not a fact claimant. These are all parasitical. These are ones who listen to what other people tell them, and they never bother to fact check. So yeah, he's simply going to be repeating stuff and nodding his head and saying, "Oh, isn't that wonderful?" But the fact that the person who's saying it have got their head up their ass, they're never going to notice that. Some of the other articles, I had a quick look at it, the fossil record one, which apparently has no discussion of fossils at all.
Yeah. Fossils disprove evolution. Not a single fossil mentioned.
Well, that makes it easier to dismiss the fossil record.
Yeah, it just, there's nothing here. It just is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence against evolution is the fossil record. If evolution occurred by slow, minute changes in living creatures, there would be thousands of times more transitional forms, fossil beds, than complete forms, which makes, for two things. First of all, what he doesn't classify anything as transitional to begin with. So
no creationist does. Literally no creationist ever, under any circumstances. That's part of the thing that I've been doing in the #KIP project, is documenting all of this stuff. The closest you get are chimeras, your crocoduck concept.
Monotremes.
Just Photoshop something together. Or the idea that a transitional would have to be alive now. That's another trope that pops up in grassroots creationism. Or that a transitional involves half-formed something or other.
Whatever that means.
So it wouldn't be fully formed, whereas all organisms are fully formed. Well, I'm sorry, but evolution doesn't involve half-formed. It involves always fully formed. Everything is functional within its frame, otherwise it wouldn't work. And that was one of the reasons why evolution slam dunk was such a good property to look at, because there you've got how to get from a reptile to a mammal. You've got to go through a functional stage which doesn't exist now, but which was literally predicted on evolutionary ground, these double jaw forms. And so if God didn't want me to believe in evolution, he shouldn't have created therapsids. That was just plain dumb.
I mean, it is so bad. Just so bad. It's hilarious. Oh, it's like they expect to find brisk half and half T in the fossil record.
Yeah, well, and the irony for one of the ones that this is usually used about the full half form thing is, where is half a wing? Well, in fact, we now know how bird wings developed, and they don't evolve half of anything. All you do is you have a already developed arm of a theropod, and it gets feathers, and those feathers can now be selected for aerodynamic characteristics. At no point did it have a little stubby thing that was going on there. That's not how it needed to work. And ironically, if you look at how the real scientists were thinking of things, they never thought of a half-form wing. They thought of something that looked basically like what we later found as these feathered theropods. And the fact that I grew up at a time when they didn't know those existed. And so they were just starting to be discovered in the 1990s, quite late in the game, when they realized that when you found particularly these Chinese deposits, which are Lagerstätten class, where they've found the fossil preservation of the feathers. And we've even got, I mentioned it in Slam Dunk, I think you may have gotten to that section, where I point out the fossilized transitional feather in amber.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was back in the Minton chapter, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's
Michael Denton.
I call him the fossil genie. The idea that there's this genie out there that really loves evolutionists, and he's just constantly creating things to make them happy and plumping them down in just the right spot, And sometimes the fossil genie doesn't come through, but the fossil genie comes through a lot.
Yeah, I mentioned that to the philosopher of science that I talked to, Dr. Pence, in a video I did fairly recently. And so he said he loves teaching about that intersection of the sort of historical science and the kind of observational science, how they intersect in these ways where you can look at the past and then make inferences and then predictions that will allow you to go back and say, hey, we should find this. If evolution's true, we should find this right here. Oh, look at that. We found it.
Yeah, and also the paleogenomic thing. I'm not sure whether you've gotten that far down into the book where I talk about it's in the thing with Copege. I think it's down in chapter 10, so you may not have gotten to that yet. But anyway, he jumped into one of these little animals. You'll already have met them earlier in the story, but it was about a fabulous technical paper that had worked out the genetics of the rib structure. Particular little rib things were forming.
Yeah,
and they've actually retro-engineered, so they know exactly what gene is involved in producing. You turn the gene on, you get the thing, you turn it off, they disappear. And so you can actually work that out. And so we can be reasonably confident that's what was going on in these little critters back then, to see how these things work out. And you can work out the lineages that have come along since, which ones inherited from which stuff. So that it isn't as though there's wonderful science data that the creationist doesn't bump into. It just is, unlike normal people, there's no fire being lit underneath them, where they, even on their own side, they never really offer any explanation for it. They're just dismissing. They're pushing stuff off the field. And you can't build a rigorous science by pushing things off of the deck. You've got to try to account for them.
Yeah, they're not very good at card games, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what the circumstances are in terms of them. You could tell a lot if they were playing a card game. But the neat thing about the more you know about the direct data, the more you can counteract the arguments that get popped up in the tropes. And so you can recognize which ones are higher level tropes, the ones that are actually being put forward by the ones with the PhDs, your Andrew Snellings, your Michael Beheys, and all of that bunch, versus the stuff that's happening farther down in the grassroots, where you get people that are just kind of riffing off stuff that they've heard through the grapevine, and they don't really know a heck of a lot about it.
The lady at the geology convention.
to the geology convention. That in the grassroots context, or people you'll encounter on Twitter or in the local world, you're highly unlikely to have bumped into anybody who's read much in the way of actual creationist literature. So you're actually having an advantage in reading Slam Dunk, in that you're bumping into the creationist literature that most creationists don't bother reading.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it has become very useful. I don't think so. I know it is very useful to read their material, to read their theology, and see what sources they're ripping off. I'm glad that I'm doing that now. I'm glad that I'm taking into account, because it is really helping. It doesn't just help dismantle the arguments. It's not just about building a counter argument. It's about taking out their argument at the source.
Yeah,
Where did
and
this
boy,
claim
do they fall apart
originate?
there. I put the evolution Slam Dunk, impoverished writer here. Everybody should have my damn book, not because it will help make me money, which it will, but also because it's damn good. And you can find the links to all the different versions. Oops, I got one too many letter in on press at tortucan.wordpress.com. But anyway, I've got the linkages to the amazon.com print version and all the different ebook versions of it. I approached everything from a source methods point of view, which means that what you'll do is read every possible creationist, anti-evolutionist discussion of the reptile-mammal transition. And you'll know at detail exactly what they've discussed and what they haven't, and how far removed they are. What are some of your favorite bits from Slam Dunk so far?
Well, I do appreciate the whole doing of Krieger's work and looking at Kathleen Hunt's work, because I've actually gone and I've started reading Hunt's papers on Talk Origins, and finally encountered the Cassids, the
Aren't
little
they
group of
fun?
Cassids. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
liked the dissection of Woodmorap. Thought that was very thorough. The Gish section drove me nuts. Just some of what he said drove me nuts.
Yeah, yeah.
Like he had the
Gish.
chart with the
Oh, go
different.
ahead.
Oh, I was the chart with the different skulls on it. He was in the debate with the other guy, and the guy used a chart, and Gish said these
Yeah,
skulls
yeah.
don't
Ken
even
Miller.
exist.
and,
They
and
do.
and he was misrepresenting everything about them. And nobody had actually caught Gish on this one before, but it turned out when I was able to get the original work that he was riffing off of, that I could actually see just how bad it was. I actually contacted Dr. Lowe at the Carnegie because he had a copy of it. It's a relatively rare paper and it's not available online, so I had to physically get a copy of it, and he kindly sent it to me. And if I can do a revised version with illustrations of Slam Dunk, I definitely want to put that one in so everybody can see exactly how far removed from the data set he is on that one. Yeah, the Krieger piece and Woodmorap in particular, I rewrote that enormously. I'd done an earlier post on that in, I think, 2006 or so. But when I went back, I completely revamped it because I now knew way more than I did then. So I came at it with seeing further mistakes that I hadn't spotted the first time around because I now had the primary sources to play around with. But Gish is still one of the top guys in the field, and Woodmorap is the only heavy gun that Answers in Genesis has to fire. So anybody reading my book will know every possible argument that they can offer, and you can just be ready to poke holes in them. That I think is a contribution.
Oh yeah, and also I find really interesting the paleogenomics work is especially interesting. I find the part about the mouse jaws, how you can change like the way the mouse jaws develop, or how you can see embryonically how the Meckel's cartilage becomes ossified and moves upward. I just think that's all
Yeah,
really cool stuff.
Evo Devo, evolutionary developmental biology, is just the cutting edge kicker. And to some extent, anybody would want to know about this stuff because that's the stuff that the intelligent design gang are trying to indicate that this somehow overturns Darwinian naturalism, and you find all of this stuff at Evolution News and Views, where you get together a lot of the heavy guns of the Evo Devo Brigade, who they're arguing that there's more to it. And then Jerry Coyne will come in from the other, says, well, but it's still basically the natural Darwinian evolution stuff, and both of them are right. It all depends on the perspective of how you look at it. I like to use the generic phrase that it's all natural evolution, that there's no magic involved, there's no design involved. All of these other factors that have come downstream since are still natural. They're not magic-y. And so that you broaden the palette of what natural selection works on, that not everything is adaptation, but a lot of things are. And when Michael Denton tries to argue that the jaw transition isn't adaptive and manages to miss all the data in doing it, it's just really astonishing.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's right. One of the papers we were looking at the other day, we were talking about reading their articles reminded me of the Snelling paper we were looking at on rapid oil formation, and how he didn't even use his own source, which he was waving around as proving him right. But if you read the introduction to the paper, it says, "We do not set out to do this thing that Snelling is saying the paper does." It's just...
Yeah, that's why that primary source thing, as I keep on repeating, and you can repeat it as Downard's mantra, source scholarship is a game Tortukans cannot play. They don't merely do it badly. They literally don't do it. All they're doing when they're citing source material is offering apologetic points. And they may or may not have any connection whatsoever to the content of the work. And the moment you look at the original work, you can see them playing that game, that they are not playing fair with their sources. And you can't build a true argument on misrepresentation of source material. It just doesn't fly.
Yeah, it is really terrible. And I think that's what made Dr. Esselstyn laugh at the Mitchell paper, was that he wrote the technical paper she was riffing off of, and just going through it saying, we didn't say this, that's not how this works. You know?
Yeah, Robert Richardson over in the live chat brings up a point about quote mining and that, and people who have been quoting Craig Venter's comment about the tree of life not fitting most of the history of life, because in addition to vertically passing genes, they also share genes among species. This goes all the way back to the first bits of where Doolittle and others were pointing out that horizontal gene transfer is occurring in bacteria, and that dissolves the normal concept of tree of life, which is based upon rigid speciation events that branch off to one another and don't share information except by sexual recombination in that lineage, which is what happens when you get into animals, for example. And that therefore this completely overturns Darwinian evolution. Jonathan Wells makes a big deal about it. It's a common trope in intelligent design, and it's a common trope and now in creationism that simply copies off of that. But it's still natural that we can see the mechanisms of how genetic information is being traded back and forth between things. So you end up with this kind of fog bank of speciation blobs in bacteria, that they have to use a very different criteria about basically population groupings rather than the conventional kind of definition of speciation populations that you would find in vertebrates. But it doesn't mean that it's still not natural. It is still absolutely rigorously natural. So you got to know enough about the context of that stuff so that they can't play that little shell game on you, and they can't sandbag you on it.
Right. Yeah.
Once you get down past the development of multicellularity, now you start seeing more conventional lineages occurring, and the normal rules still apply. So there's still a tree there.
Yeah, it's a tree of life, but really only once you get into the eukaryotes, and kind of away from, like, upwards away from the protists and those guys, and then once you kind of get up there, then it becomes more of the tree, the conventional tree.
When you look at how relatively conservative bacteria are, they're very good at shuffling information around while still retaining the primary structure. Is that it's hardly surprising that before sexual recombination, organisms stay very stable. and that the variations that we see in sexually reproducing organisms and ones that have organelles in their cells, that's an endosymbiotic process. So bacteria that don't develop that alter, and they're still with us, and they're really damn good at what they do. That's why they don't go away. That there's more bacterial cells on and in you than there are you cells.
Oh yeah,
So
there's a book on
they're
that.
all over the place.
There's a book on it called 10% Human for anyone who's interested.
Yeah.
Um,
And yet it still doesn't make all the natural biological evolution going away. And the irony is that so much what we now know about how these complex systems are developing are because we've studied all of that bacteria stuff that are supposedly disapproving of the tree of life. But we can see in the details, no, that's just illuminates more about how the tree of life ended up the way it did. Oh, Robert Richardson said, I should be proud of you. He recently called someone out of his source methodology using that term and showed how he was faulty. Yes, that's it. It's the ultimate killer. Ask the simple trade-off question is ever so easy. Says who and how did you check it? Those two sentences are like crucifixes to vampires. For people who are bad scholars, that a lot of them won't know what sources are. They can't remember what the sources were, or if they had, well, they're damn well not going to have fact check them. Look at Mark Huffman. That literally never would have occurred to them that they need to source check them.
Oh yeah,
and you find this in all contexts.
Yep, it is the one, and the best part about it is it's one size fits all.
I use it with Dinesh D'Souza. I use it with everyone, and everyone can use it with me. If anyone has doubts about what I say on things, I just love it when somebody says, oh, really? Well, what sources do you have? I'm happy to oblige. Thank you for asking. And I'll dump into it because I've done the research on the thing. Well, this very program was an example of asking an interesting question. Well, how did evolution produce sex and when? And I looked up my material and I followed up. I'd fortunately just been doing some material, as I pointed out, that I was based on some stuff that you had thrown at me in a tweet chat where I did follow up on it. So I had a whole list of material that I hadn't known before that bore specifically onto this issue. The two papers whose charts that I just put up were ones I found out about by following up on the point you had brought up regarding that 1972 paper that you had been mentioned as a context of stuff that you had learned in your classes. And that mechanism, everybody can do it. This ain't magic. What I did was I took the paper you had given me, and I not only got that paper, but then I Googled the title to find out how it had been used since. And that you could see the technical literature start piling up. And then you could see what topics were being discussed. So then I was looking up, the origin of anisogamy. Boy, I have trouble saying that word. My tongue gets tangled up on it. And so now I could find the technical literature that bore onto that. And you could start seeing trends and structures. Now I had a better understanding of the material and was able then to respond more effectively when a question came up about it just a couple of days later. That's how you learn. And it's something that anybody can do. I'm just a BA in history guy. I'm not a science guy in the sense of, somebody that's going for my PhD in whateverology, as opposed to you, Jackson. You're actually in the field doing the work. And so it's understandable that you will be more focused on particular disciplines. I have to be by nature a generalist. Yeah, I have to be a generalist because I'm going after all of anti-evolutionism, and they just trample everything. So that not only do I have to go after things like the reptile-mammal transition and dinosaurs and the organ development of sex, but also the geologic column and the formation of elements and the space-time continuum and the history of the Egyptians and the development of language in the New World. Every possible subject that you could think of eventually gets trampled on or bears upon either young Earth creationism or intelligent design. And so long as I can keep at it, I'll try to keep at it. I suppose that I also put up a wonderful example of pathetic shameless plug where my Patreons, and I will call attention to, let me get my magic screen share thing, which always takes a while to pop up. Yipes, yipes, yipes. This is the peskiest thing to do because I go to the spot of the screen where the little window is supposed to pop up, and then it takes me forever to get the damn thing out. There we go. Put up the screen sharing and our Patreons. I got one new one today, dear Jody. I should point out, alas, that Patreon is not exactly Johnny on the spot in terms of giving money. So unfortunately, all the Patreons that you see on the screen have been very generous in giving money to the project, but I haven't seen any of it yet because it hasn't reached the threshold of their disbursement. So I will shamelessly also point out the www.gofundme.com, where you can give in any amount, you know, $5 if even if there, but I get that money way faster. And it's an advantage that certainly means an enormous amount to somebody who's on Social Security like I am and now has to pay for Medicare. So I literally have less to live on than I did before. I know this sounds pathetic because it is, but nonetheless, I can't say I don't love doing the work that I do. I do. I love #tip. I love doing the research. I love combating every possible thing and teaching as many people the tricks of the trade so they can do it too because it works. And at the same time, it's all volunteer, damn it. And it's all people that I have books to sell and please buy the books and all of that because that's the only supplemental income I have. And I'm literally rationing my ink because I can't, I'm just at the bottom of the black and the cyan and the yellow to where I can't print much more. Otherwise, it's going to go into, oops, and I don't have money to get that. It's a labor-intensive project that has been expanded by the fact that we have so much more information available. But that's also the strength, theoretically, we have, that the more we interconnect through all of these networks, either on Twitter and social media and at #tip, please come by the damn website and say hi. The things that people learn, I've created like a tripwire system on Twitter. It's actually the most effective social media I've ever encountered, is that I can find the people who do the technical work and I discover they're on Twitter. So bingo, I follow them. And they're giving me heads up on their work. They're giving me the peek over the hood at the cutting edge in a whole bunch of different fields in paleoanthropology and genetics and developmental biology. And I find lots of new material. Sometimes they are simply doing something I'm already aware of from another context, but I'm like this spider tendrils. If everybody can connect up effectively that way, we can do a hell of a lot. The goal of the TIP project is not only to create a giant website that's interactive and what you see at the moment is all freebie stuff. I don't have money to be able to do anything more elaborate than that. I haven't even mastered the techniques of how to put a search engine up, and I'm going to have to convert all the PDFs over to HTMLs. I think I've got to do an awful lot of stuff yet on that, and I'm still clumsily knocking around on there. But beyond just that data set that everyone can draw on is the idea of having a social network where we have a trigger force everywhere, where no creationist can go onto a college campus or do a thing in public where they're spewing drivel, that somebody locally not only is there to be able to respond to them, but will have access to all of this information easily, where they can bring it up so they've got strong ammo and they can
oh boy,
hit back with the maximum.
I would love if they could send someone down here and to talk on this subject. I would love to roast them on stage. Unfortunately, they don't do that kind of thing as far as I've ever seen here. We're a very mild place.
Most conventional universities won't. But Answers in Genesis did a show at the University of Montana. That's State University. And I found out about it, ironically, because SciStrike had called my attention to it on Twitter. I didn't know about it. I didn't have enough money to be able to go there. It was literally within driving distance. I could have gone. And what turned out to be the case, nobody in the secular community there and pro-evolution community was pushing back on it. Nobody reported on it. Nobody did a damn thing on it. And that's unconscionable in this day and age. We have too many people available. It wasn't because nobody was there. It's because they didn't have the tools available to be able to push back and at the very least report on it and record it in the same way that I've mentioned to you about how you can make use of interactions with creationists as a live streaming opportunity and live theater improv that you can use to put it into the public realm. So now it has a connection that you don't have otherwise. Richardson points out in the live chat there that in college in South Louisiana, we had a creationist come to debate one of our professors, and I set up a computer database with 2 other grad students, and when they tried the Gish Gallop, we'd print the papers to hand to the professor answering it. Even better yet, especially in regards to a lot of creationists that have paper trails, you can do a lot of pre-research on this. And so it isn't even a matter of having to do on the fly. You can preemptively anticipate what's going on. One of the reasons why I make a point about the reptile-mammal transition, if you force somebody onto that turf, you literally will know everything you need to know about that and all of the stuff they could have read because I've already covered it. And that's the goal in all of TIP eventually, to have stuff on speciation issues, on the development of origin of life stuff, all of the stuff to where it's a super data set that instead of it being a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there and a bunch of single postings, it's part of a giant network where it's all there and you can then pick off the information that you need. You can find out who's written what about what and all of that. It's a giant project to do. And I don't know whether I'll live to finish it or not, or whether I'll be able to hand the thing over to somebody in future. But I think it's something that needs to be done. We have no excuse in the 21st century to not be up on the data stream. It's too accessible. And it doesn't do any good to just cite an old Talk Origins piece or some little paragraph long thing from the University of California that says why macroevolution is true. That doesn't cut it because it's not nearly detailed enough to be able to respond. You don't have to immediately jump in with detail, but what you want is to ease them on with those methods questions onto where you can now have a point at issue which is empirical and factual. And if you're there with the facts and you know how they can't be there with the facts, unless you're just clumsy.
Exactly. Yep, I agree.
Oh, Richard said that was 20 years ago. Resources were much more slim on his interaction there at the creation. Oh, indeed. That was a point that I'm call attention to. And that one of the things that makes our modern world so much better is that when I was starting to work on the TIP project in the 1990s, it maybe 10 or 20% of the data was available free online. Now it's 80 or 90%. And often you can find really old works that are surprisingly accessible in PDF format that pop up either on professors' websites or on archival sites, Project Gutenberg and others. And then, of course, you got ResearchGate, Academia EDU. Most of the biological journals tend to be free after a short period of time. But even now, a few of the paleontology stuff is starting to become open access. A lot of them are still heavily dependent upon subscribers and that because there's not a huge amount of money. Nobody goes into paleontology with the idea of becoming rich. You do it because you adore it. And so it's something where they actually literally have to depend upon their revenue stream from selling their material. So I can understand why they don't make it free. But a lot of the papers get available around that network by professors posting it on their sites or college courses that have particular seminal works on there. And bit by bit, I begin to create a bigger and bigger data set. Because I guarantee you, don't ever trust a creationist who cites a primary source. Look at the primary source. Or they're pulling a fast one, or they've got it secondarily from somebody else and never bothered to read it. That does happen too.
Yeah, they have not read it. Very likely. Or
yeah,
you know,
and in the course of your reading it, you'll learn more about it now than they did. So now you've increased your understanding of the phenomenon, and now you're farther and farther ahead of them. And part of the reason I think that people get into fluster effects when they get with anti-evolutionists is because they'll be sandbagged by some claim, and you have to kind of rattle around to try to figure out a way to respond to it. Whereas the more you have the information to where you can't be sandbagged because you know the data field, that you can then figure out how you're going to maneuver into the right spot to be able to drop anvils on them. And you've got the anvils to drop because you know the information.
Yep. That's the best part of the
Well,
source methods approach.
yeah, it's not rocket science. If it were rocket science, I wouldn't be doing it. But it's just diligence, and you learn to Google intelligently. Often Google the technical title of a work. And then once you discover what it's about, Google the subject matters, the linchpin arguments that pop up. Gradually, in reading stuff, you get used to the technical jargon. And although science may sound intimidating, it's no worse than the law or any other rigorous discipline. If you talk to a piano tuner or a musician, they've all got technical jargon because they use precise terms to describe specific things because they don't want to have to explain it all the time. They can just go right to the technical. And so a part of the difficulty that you would have in diving into technical literature is just figuring out the structure of it and what technical jargon means. But again, it's not magic. If you look at, when I was doing research on Woodmurat, for example, I would look at the charts of what the animals were and what the muscle details were in the papers that he was citing. And there's the list of the A, B, C, and D. It tells that this is a particular bone and that's the parietal and blah, blah, blah. And you gradually figure out what the hell's going on with what the terms mean. Everything is laid out there like baby steps if you recognize that the terminology is there to facilitate precise meaning, not as a way just as a barrier to the outsider. It's because it's stuff that speeds up the discussion process. So a lot of things, what you'll find in geology papers, almost never do they say how old something is in a geology paper. They'll just refer to the period it's in because everybody knows what that is. So they don't bother putting dates next to things most of the time. So you would have to do a background thing to find out when the Frasinian was to realize what the time frame was. But once you learn those little tricks of the trade in that, it's just a matter of following up on it. And you can even measure your own expertise by downloading a technical paper and reading it. Understand or can't make hide nor hair of its content, then don't get into discussions with creationists because you'll probably do poorly if any of them know any of the kind of jargons, because you'll be arguing at a higher level of just pot shots at each other and not on details.
Yeah, I mean, there's also there are people like Ray Comfort out there who claim to be afraid of big words, though. So,
oh well, yeah, well, and it's easy to maneuver around that because I follow the James Burke rule. For those of you who don't know who James Burke was, he's the guy that did the Old Connection series way back before a lot of you people were born, back in the 1970s, and you can still find his books at the library. And he was a model of an absolutely ideal science educator. His principle was, as a science journalist, is that anything that can be understood can be explained. And my corollary is that if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. So the thing is to reach the stage where you can explain things in just a common generic term. The reptile mammal transition, you're talking about bones, and you have the bone here, and you can physically touch your face and connect up to the zygomatic arch and the coronoid process and all these other things that are the technical terms. And you don't need to have a carry around thing or a PowerPoint to do that. You can literally make use of props that you have with you, your own body. And so that's another advantage of having the reptile mammal transition. Anybody that you can describe bacterial systems, you can describe geological processes. Any of these things can be done. The map of time is another area that you want to make sure you have a sense of, that an awful lot of anti-evolutionists, independent of whether they're young earth creationists or not, will have a really weird idea of the chronology sequence. And you need to realize that they might not be playing on the same field you are. So you need to clarify chronology issues typically in these discussions. And that may find out that they don't know diddly about it, in which case that's another feather in your cap and a problem for them. Hayev says he both explains in the live chat, he both explains jargon and hyperlink to things like Wikipedia when I use jargon. There's some things where a terminology is highly relevant. Always beware of people who toss jargon off and not explain it. Remember the section in Slam Dunk where Michael Denton goes on about ants and never explains a damn thing about them?
Hey, look at these words I know. I don't have to explain these because I know them.
Gish did the same thing in a lot of his stuff. You toss off jargon and it makes you sound so erudite because you're using all of these terminologies.
Or
But what the hell do they
Berlinski.
mean? And
Berlinski uses big words also.
he loves to preen about his high vocabulary. That this is Proust on a bad day with him. But I'm just a slump. I love good words. I love fascinated terminology and things, and some are useful to use. There's going to be terms that are going to pop up a lot in evolutionary context. I don't typically have to use a lot of them at a higher level when discussing a lot of basic issues because I can just explain it in terms of the structural elements of things. And the more you can link up with what people are already aware of, in geology context, talking about their own backyard is useful in dealing with young Earth creationism. In talking about the biological context to try to figure out what's going on in terms of speciation and the like. You know, the simplest question is: do all your cousins drop dead when you were born? Then why do you have a problem with things that are cousins in the geological record? Wouldn't that be inevitable? Why would you think that would be any different? And if they can't get past those hurdles, and typically creationists can't get past those hurdles, you're not arguing with them, you're using it to discuss to somebody else. That's why I think interactions with creationists in an audience format, in which you've got people who need their minds changed, and they're watching your exchange with the anti-evolutionists. That's why I think debates and discussions can actually be useful if done in the proper context. If you've done your homework properly and you do it in a conversational, polite way, but not give them any slack. Paranorm just put up James Burke's Connections Playways. Oh, if any of those, yes, are on a video, yeah, indeed. Not as fast-paced as what we're used to today, but don't get confused with the medium over the message. James Burke's Connections was the most influential intellectually series I've ever seen, way more than Cosmos. Cosmos didn't teach me a damn thing I didn't already know. Connections completely
It had good graphics, though.
Oh, yeah, it was a cute show, but I already knew about the evolution. I knew about the stellar physics. There was nothing new in it, or even for that matter, in most of the new series. I mean, it was good, fine, dandy, blah, blah, blah. Connections changed how I thought about stuff. I now completely rethought the notion about the great man theory of science, about how economics and politics and personal foibles interact to produce technological development, about the unpredictability of technological development. Nobody can anticipate where a technology is going to go. No one's going to be able to look at people developing spray nozzles to put perfume on so that they didn't have to smell the stench of dung is going to lead to the carburetor in the automobile. Nobody would then be able to anticipate that. Or the fact that women like linen underwear in the Middle Ages led to the computer. I mean, literally, that one thing leads to another in a series of complex connections that changes the way you think about things. It changed the way I thought about economic policy and technology policy as to how you would deal with things. Oh, yeah. James Burke is, plus he's hilarious. One of the scenes, there was a scene involving the Middle Ages, and they were doing a scene at a medieval trade fair. And suddenly, and this was in the BBC, which is kind of risque for the time, that there's a naked woman bathing in a tub. And then suddenly his head pops into the frame. Now that we have your attention. Yeah, so I love James Byrne. You can almost measure the imagination of people who can watch Connections and not be exhilarated by it. If they go, yeah, then you probably go, they're probably not going to get some stuff. Yeah, Paranormal, Burke, effing hilarious and done so seriously. His principle then was to explain stuff in a clear and straightforward way. And he covered Darwin and Einstein and Newton and industrial chemistry and just a colossal amount of things that make the world we live in today. He did, I think, 3 or 4 series. He did all book versions of those, so you can find those if you're more of a reader form. And I found out so much about the medieval technological revolution in Czechoslovakia. in the 1200s, where they were learning about how pumping systems work. They were looking about control technology, the kinds of things they were doing with these big pounders that would be pounding up and down that were powered by the water wheels, leads ultimately to computer technology. So part of the thing, along with the ladies' linen things, and about how you make paper with the pounders, and how you control the things with pounders, and the fact that Gutenberg, it's no coincidence that he was a silversmith, because silversmiths people had made little cartridges to make stamps to do the hallmarks, and that was then applied to figure out that you could do individual letters and put them in a thing that you used in a wine press to make a printing press. One thing connects up to another. Nobody invents anything cold. Everybody draws off the culture and technology of thousands of minds before them, and that you put things together in fresh new ways to make new stuff, but nobody's the Captain Nemo inventing the atomic submarine all on his own. That isn't how it works. Well, we're way past the thing. I've run over again, and I've managed to slog along cheery and happy, even though my financial situation is desperately bad. So I will say, please check out my website. Any of that you can help in the GoFundMe or the Patreon. The GoFundMe is faster. And of course, either one of my books, if you like to read. I will ask a plug from Jackson, since he's reading Evolution Slam Dunk, summarize why it's not a bad thing.
It is a great book. You get to see all of this data, and not just reptile mammal transition stuff. He covers birds, such as the evolution of the feathers. He talks about chloroquine resistance in mosquitoes, and ants. There's a whole bit on ant typology. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that is useful across the board.
I wanted a book that if you came into the Creation Evolution issue cold, you didn't know diddly squat, that you'd come away from it with an awful lot of the ammo under your belt, and you'd know who the characters are, you'd know the players on the field, so that when you bump into them, oh, I know about that idiot, and I know why he's an idiot.
Yeah, it's an all-around great book. It's taught me a lot of neat stuff.
And I will, for those of you getting it from Amazon, read Christine Janis's review of it. Christine Janis is a mammal paleontologist. She had been studying my work, little did I know, for quite a while, and had bought the book on her own. And she was delighted with it. She calls it an incredible tour de force. She recommends it highly. She literally has had to revise her new mammal book based on information that she had got from my book that she didn't know about in her own field. The Permian mammal poop, the therapsid poop that had the little hair traces in it that suggested that mammal hair was going all the way back into the Permian side of the therapsids. And that was really interesting information, among other things, in there. And so I'm very proud of the work that I've done on that. I deliberately chose a topic that was not covered in as much detail in the free stuff that's at #tip, the Troubles in Paradise site, so that this would be an adjunct. Eventually, if I can keep at it, hint, hint, all that information will be folded into the stuff at TIP in the long term. All the book material that I do on that, and the next thing that I'm doing, if I can live long enough to do it, is the Discovery Institute Descent from Darwin list. No one's really done a full court press analysis of that, and who's on it, and what contributions they do or not, and why it doesn't mean quite what they think it does. There's been one piece that was done at Talk Reason, or the reason.org, I think. Rational Wiki, that was it.
Yeah, the Rational Wiki. Yeah.
But that's all. And I felt I needed that there was much more that could be said about all of this. And it also brings in the issue about how peripheral the anti-evolutionists with PhDs are to the basic scientific community currently. That, yeah, they've got PhDs, but boy, they're all minor players. So that will be the next subject matter. I got a whole stack of stuff on a table that's going to be the core of that, and I'll be tackling that after I finish the next Phileas Fogg novel, assuming I can keep the power on and pay my insurance premiums and all the other things that I have to do, and have less money to go on it. So it's a sob story, but it's an honest sob story. So anyway, I hope people, Hayab points out the Learning Channel did the 2 sequel seasons. Yeah, it took a long time for them to come out on DVD, get the initial series out on DVD. when I still had the money to be able to buy DVDs. But the fact that a lot of it's on streaming should be able to go do so. So I'll plug James Burke's stuff. He should be quite old by now. I haven't seen him do a lot of material in quite a long time, so I think he's in retirement. But he's an exhilarating mind and a great influence on me. And plus, it's rip-snortingly good science and history and philosophy and economics and all sorts of stuff about how everything interconnects. So we've gone, as usual, past an hour on this. I'd like to thank Jackson for coming onto the scene and discussing all the little fiddly bits about the origin of sex in biology and our forays into creationist stupidity in other areas. And if I'm still running along, I'll see you next week with another episode. I'm thinking of doing stuff on the trope. We're all using the same data, just a different philosophy. We're not using naturalism.
Oh,
That
goodness.
one. Unless somebody comes up, I always like to ask people on Twitter and others if they have subject matter for an evolution hour. And if I do, I'll preempt and push the thing over. But otherwise, that's what's scheduled for Evolution Hour 24. Thank you very much for coming in, and we will now be concluding this evening's extemporaneous broadcast.